Well, hi. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, get exam fit for GCSE Spanish paper 4, and this afternoon we're looking at the higher tier question 2. And of course, this training this afternoon works with the 2016 specification. It's not anything to do with the new specs that are on their way. I'm going to just switch my camera off now that I've got everybody here today. So what we're going to do this afternoon is we're going to sort of look at understanding the mark schemes in detail. We're going to be looking at some mark scripts to understand the context. And then we're going to get you to do a bit of sort of blind trial marking just to confirm your understanding and to sort of standardize your approaches to assessment. And then in the sort of final session, we're going to just have a think about kind of developmental feedback. So the scripts that we look at, we're going to look at those and we're going to say, well, actually, if you had that student in your class, what advice would you be giving them? How would you be helping them? How would you be helping them to achieve a slightly better mark than they actually achieved there? Okay, so those are really the sort of objectives for this afternoon. Now, you'll be pleased to know that it's going to be a part listening to me and also part working in breakout rooms. So we'll drop you into breakout rooms at certain points with some of your colleagues. I'm here on my own today, so I'll keep an eye on the chat at certain points in the Q&A, and I'll try and pick up on those at certain points as we go through. But forgive me if I don't answer your question or respond to your chat immediately. And if it is towards the end of the session that you think he still hasn't answered that question, please just ask it again, because it will simply be that I've missed it. Because it came at a point where I was concentrating on what I was saying about the presentation in front of me. So I'm going to begin really by talking to you a bit about the way we apply the mark schemes at Pearson, and we have lots of training events where teachers ask, are students penalized for such and such a behavior or for this, that, and the other? So I think the first thing that's really important to say is that the approach to marking is positive and it's compassionate. So in fact, what we do really is we look as examiners to find what students do and what they do well, and we give them credit for that, and we almost ignore the things that they don't do so well. That's not to say we don't take account of errors and mistakes and so on and so forth, but the big focus is on the positive approaches to marking that we apply. Now, that said, you will notice that this particular question operates around two mark schemes, one for communication and content and one for linguistic knowledge and accuracy. And again, one of the things that sometimes it's important for teachers to understand is that we apply those mark schemes on what we would call a best fit approach. So we talk about best fit, not exact match. So sometimes there will be something mentioned in the mark scheme and you think, oh, I'm not sure if that candidate really did that very well, but they did do all the other things in that box. And so they will still be in that mark box. And we're not saying, actually, if you don't do any of those, if there's one of those things that you don't do at all, you're not necessarily excluded from that mark box, except in a few circumstances where I will explain as we go forward. So again, just try to think about those mark boxes in terms of the best fit. And the specification gives you guidance about, first of all, choosing the correct band within the mark grids and then looking for the marks. So it's also sometimes a good idea not to think too much about numbers before you start, but actually to try to locate the band. and be fairly confident about the band that you're putting the mark into. And I think it's also worth keeping an eye as well on the qualifying words, the always, frequently, sometimes, rarely, etc., because those sometimes are kind of keys to what we're looking for. So that's sometimes how the mark bands are differentiated from each other. So having said that, we're going to dive in now and we're going to have a look in detail at writing higher tier question 2. Now, I'm going to start really by talking to you about the question. Those of you who are teaching Pearson and have taught this lots and lots of times before will be very familiar with this. There may be people who are new to Pearson this year, and also teachers who haven't taught GCSE before or haven't taught it for a while. So I'm going to just talk you through the format of the question, the format of that question 2 in the paper. It's a higher tier question 2. Now, in the higher tier paper, question 1 is that crossover question, which some of you who were with us a week or so ago when we looked at that will have worked on. And that crossover question, it takes students through the grades that overlap between foundation and higher tier. So typically the grades 3, 4, 5 are targeted by that crossover question, and the higher grades in the higher tier paper, so grade 6 and above, really are where we're looking for the differentiation with this particular question 2. Okay, so as we look at the mark scheme, you will see that the mark scheme demands more. The task demands more in terms of coverage of language and ideas, and also word count. So it's a more demanding task, and it's designed to be more demanding, and it is also where we would want the higher tier students, the able students, to really show off their quality of language. So question 2A or 2B. So the first thing to say is that candidates have this choice between 2 options. They can choose A or B. Each of the 2 options will sit within the topic list from the specification, and it will target a particular sub-theme from those themes in the specification. So in the example that we see in front of us, we've got the choice between writing about sports events or writing about voluntary work. Now, it's also important to note that each of those choices has 4 bullet points. And the thing that I want to draw your attention to here is that word debes in bold, okay? That must. So you must mention the following points. So I'll say this again in a moment, but in terms of linguistic knowledge and accuracy, but in particular in terms of communication and content, students need to have talked about and dealt with all 4 of those bullet points in order to fulfill the requirements of the task. And that's where, if they haven't dealt with all 4 of those, their mark for communication and content will be limited, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. And they're also told, justifica tus ideas y tus opiniones. They have to justify their ideas and opinions. So we're looking for opinions and justification in those in the way that they deal with those bullet points. And they're also told to write 130 to 150 words in Spanish, and we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So let's dig into one of the tasks. They all work in the same way. So whatever your students get coming along in summer 2025, the format will be familiar, the layout will be familiar, the expectation will be familiar, but obviously the question will be a new question which hasn't been asked before. So sports events, they have a title, and the topic of the task is stated, so they know what it is they're going to choose to write about. So they will have chosen this one, or they would have chosen the voluntary work topic. And they're given that in English. So immediately their choice is not dependent on, whether they can really understand every bit of the Spanish. There is nothing to understand. So they're given that in English, and they decide, where it is they think they have the best range of vocabulary, the best range of language to talk about and to choose that topic. Now, they're then given the format of the task. So it says here, escribe un artículo para interesar a la gente. Okay, so they're expected to write an article. So it could be a blog post, might be some magazine article. So that purpose of the task gives them the format for what they're expected to do. But actually, what they get the marks for is for dealing with the 4 bullet points. So they're asked to do 4 things. They're asked to give a general view about the topic. So, lo que piensas de los eventos deportivos. What you think about sports events. So they have to give their general view. Okay, remembering that they're asked to justify their ideas and opinions. So it's not just I like them or they are important, but why? Okay, we're looking for the why. We're looking for because those ideas and opinions need to be justified. They're then asked to do some past narration. Okay, so un evento que ocurrió en el pasado. So they have to tell a little story. Okay, so an event that happened in the past, sports event that we're looking for. So that's testing their ability to use past time frame. And when we say past time frame, it may be that some of the weaker students who attempt this higher tier paper might only do a few simple preterite tenses, but we'd expect the better ones to be able to use imperfect, possibly some pluperfect, perfect, etc., so that we've got that range of evidence of past time frame. And then they're expected to give a personal view. So the general view is one thing, and then they give a personal view. ¿Por qué es importante practicar el deporte? Okay, so they're expected to give their personal view. And here again, they might be expected to justify their ideas and opinions. That bullet point lends itself very well to that. And then they're expected to show that they can use a future time frame, un deporte que harás en el futuro. Notice we're saying future time frame rather than future tense. So future time frame could include conditional as well. And we would define future time frame as just them talking about something that hasn't happened yet. And so sometimes we say, well, actually, do we want future tense? Can we use the future with ir, etc.? Anything that they do that shows that they can use that future time frame is acceptable. But as you will see in a moment or two, when we look at the mark schemes, we are looking for that range and variety. So again, if a student only ever writes voy a with an infinitive, and we have that 3 or 4 times, that's not going to be quite as effective as somebody who is going to vary the person of the verb, or maybe vary the particular tense that they use to express the future, and that would go for the past as well. Okay, so variety, that sort of range of structures, that range of tenses, is a good indicator of quality at the top end. And then just they're told at the end, escribe aproximadamente 130 a 150 palabras en español. Now, that's a sort of word range that's suggested. However, everything that they write is marked, and sometimes we do get candidates who will write considerably more than that. But it does tend to be the case that answers that are too long or too short are sort of self-penalizing. So, if they write far too much, they tend to have drifted away from the bullet points, and they're also likely to have made more mistakes. If they write far too little, they may hardly have covered one or two of the bullet points, and they also won't have covered the range of language, because if all they write was, last year I went to the Olympics, you haven't done very much past narration there. So the range isn't covered if what they write is short. Now, sometimes again, we have questions about whether they need to write the same amount about each of the 4 bullet points. And they don't really. There isn't a particular requirement to do those things evenly. However, it's probably good practice, because they have a limited amount of time. They have a sort of limited range of sort of, the amount of words that they can do. So sort of 30 to 35 sort of 30 to 35 words about each of those bullet points would be kind of good practice. And if they want to write more, they can write more. And of course, everything they write is marked. But just, I think, important to sort of guide them to that sort of range. And the other thing is that range is very important. Range of ideas for the communication and content, range of things that they say, and also the range of grammatical structures, use of vocabulary, and so on, for the linguistic knowledge and accuracy. And so a good way to expand that range is really just to make sure that there's fairly good and even coverage of each of those bullet points. Okay. So let's just have a look now at the mark scheme and at the mark grids before we get you to sort of dive in and do some marking. So the first thing then, I think, is that we need to just have a look at the 2 mark grids. The 2 mark grids are applied by examiners separately, and we'd encourage you, when you do your practice marking in a moment or two, also to apply those separately. So think about communication and content separately from linguistic knowledge and accuracy. But let's just have a look at that 13 to 16 mark box in communication and content first of all. So we're told that to be in that box, the candidate communicates detailed information relevant to the task with consistently effective development of key points and ideas. Okay, so not only do they give an idea, they develop an idea. Okay. Consistently effective adaptation of language to narrate, inform, interest, and convince. Okay, so again, we're looking for candidates to have done all of those things. Now, the narrate, for example, is particularly something that sits with that past tense bullet point. And so it's hard to say that you have consistently effective adaptation of language if you've only used one simple past tense, for example. So that range there is important. And inform, interest, and convince. The interest and convince is the opinion and justification. I'm convinced by what you say, because you've not only said something is important, but you've also said why. We're looking for creative use of language to express and fully justify a wide range of individual thoughts, ideas, and points of view, and also a wide variety of vocabulary and expression. So with lots of examples of uncommon language. Now, again, when we talk about uncommon language, we're really talking about not always using the same old things which candidates sort of fall back on. So if I give you an example, if we were talking about sport, we would expect that we're going to see a lot about football. But actually, if we were reading something about maybe cricket, or we were seeing something about baseball, basketball, so that was something that's a slightly less common sport, that would count as more uncommon language. If they talk about what they eat, they don't always have to eat pizza. They could have some seafood or something else. So again, one thing that you can usefully do with your students is just to make sure that they've got that sort of variety of vocabulary, and particularly for the things that they talk about a lot. And there are certain things that they will say an awful lot. And it's a bit like having an opinion about your school, for example. It's like, I don't like homework. But actually, if there's something that they could pick upon that's distinctive to their school, for example, that would, again, help them have that sort of wide variety of vocabulary and some of that uncommon language. So we're not particularly thinking about idiom or anything like that. We're just saying not always the most regularly used high frequency vocabulary. And those of you who are preparing now for the new specification will be sort of aware of this vocabulary frequency idea. And we're also looking for consistent use of appropriate register and style throughout. So obviously, if they're told that they're writing an article for a newspaper, we might want a slightly more formal tone than if they're writing a blog post for other teenagers of their own age. Okay, so those things really for communication and content. And then when we talk about linguistic knowledge and accuracy, we're looking for that wide range of grammatical structures, including some complex language. And the specification talks about what we mean by complex language. But complex language, it typically is where we might see things like a range of clause types. We might see some subordinate clauses and so on. We might also see some more conceptually challenging tenses and so forth. So that wide range of variety of grammatical structures is important. And also within those grammatical structures, remember as well that it's quite often the task is something that you could do almost all in first person singular and possibly some third person singular. But actually, students who've been able to use things like first person plural and third person plural, and they've also talked about going, if they talk about going somewhere and I went there and my friend came and she thought, all of that kind of thing about moving across persons of the verb is helpful in kind of delivering on that range of language, as indeed is when we're looking sort of a little bit further down about consistently accurate language instruction, consistently successful references to past, present, and future events. So here again, if we're talking about past tenses, past timeframes, a candidate who just writes fui, and then commis hasn't shown particularly consistent. It might be successful, but we haven't shown the range. But actually, if they have somehow included some irregular verbs and they've included maybe a reflexive and so on and so forth, and across a range of persons of the verb, that can be very helpful in showing that they have that sort of range. So we're told also there that the response is fluent throughout with extended well-linked sentences, and also that any errors don't hinder the clarity of communication. So there are what we'd call kind of minor errors and major errors. So a minor error is a sort of slip, and it's a kind of thing that doesn't stop a Spanish person from understanding perfectly well what you mean. So even things like a gender error, an error with an adjective, a simple adjective agreement error, those don't impede communication. But obviously, if instead of tuvo, the candidate writes tenio, which we do see sometimes, of course, and you will have seen this as that sort of thing as a teacher. That really does, because that really means that that kind of communication is hindered because the person who's reading it really could be very confused by that and not understand. So that would kind of count as a much more significant error. So just think about those errors that do not hinder the clarity of communication are the things where you can read past it. And the other thing to say about those errors that do not hinder the clarity of or that rarely hinder the clarity of communication is that that particular characteristic of that mark box is affected by how often they do it. Because if there's just the occasional one, you see past them. If they come, almost 2 in every line that the candidate writes, that again hinders the sort of speed at which you can read it, and it hinders the clarity. As I mentioned when we were looking at that sort of seaside slide at the beginning, we talked about the best fit. It's quite possible to be in that 13 to 16 or that 10 to 12 box and have a little bit of something not quite there. So for example, in that 10 to 12 box for linguistic knowledge and accuracy, if everything else is really good, but we've only got 2 very simple past tenses, they could still be in that box. They're probably not going to be a 12, but they could still be a 10. Okay, so that's where we would say that's sort of, we've kind of got the best fit approach, and we're applying that best fit approach as we go across. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you, we're going to just pop you into, I've talked loads about those things to do with mark schemes, but I'm going to give you 5 minutes in a breakout room just to have a look at the communication and content mark scheme. And again, just to go through and turn over what you understand by those particular parts of the mark scheme. If I've talked about it, did that make sense? So we'll give you 5 minutes and then we'll get a little bit of feedback from you. And then we're going to do the same with the linguistic knowledge and accuracy mark scheme. I'll try and drop you into rooms. Hopefully people join the rooms. If you find you're in a room on your own, one of us will come and we'll sort of rescue you, and we will drop you into a room with someone else. But we will try and open up. Hopefully, I think we're going to open up three breakout rooms. Let's have a go. And then you should go in there just for 5 minutes to discuss the communication and content marks. Okay, so let's go. You should be going into those now. Okay, good. So with a bit of luck, people were able to have a bit of a talk with your colleagues in one of the rooms. I think we had a problem with room 3, so hopefully everybody had a chance. So from room 1, Aisha, are you there? Are you able to talk? To not to worry, don't worry. Let's not let's move on, and we're going to have a look. We're going to have a think now about the linguistic knowledge and accuracy grids. So I'm going to again just pop you into the room. We'll just do 2 or 3 minutes and get you just to talk about those things, about what we mean by variety of grammatical structures, complex language, fluent, talk about extended sentences, well-linked, accurate, past, present, future references, errors, and also about clarity of communication. So let's just do the same thing again then, and then we'll get on with doing some marking. material. So what we're going to get you to do is to have a look at exemplar 1 and exemplar 2, which you will find in the pack. So we're going to give you, well, we're going to say sort of 15 minutes. Well, again, we'll pop you into groups. So you'll need to have a read through the 2 scripts. And those 2 scripts come with comments from the principal examiner. So they're marked scripts. You'll be able to see the mark, you'll be able to see the commentary. And we just really want you to spend some time just to make sure that you understand how those marks are arrived at and how they fit with the mark scheme, keeping in mind that sort of best fit approach. So we're going to get you to do that. We're going to come back in 15 minutes and then we'll get a little bit of feedback on those. And then we're going to spend a bit of time getting you to do some marking yourself, sort of marking blind. So again, we'll pop you back into your breakout rooms for about 15 minutes to have a look at exemplar 1 and exemplar 2. Come back to get, I'm never very sure what happens with these breakout rooms, so do forgive me. I dropped in and listened in a little bit. Is there anything, just sort of before we move on, is there anything that anything people found really surprising in those, or did it all seem kind of pretty much what you would have expected?
Well, we thought the exemplar 2 was a bit harshly marked.
Did you? Why?
Because there are some good ideas there and some good use of grammar. It's not that inaccurate. So we were saying that we thought it was a bit too harshly marked. Am I right?
Well, I mean,
Somebody
those
else
were the
there?
those, yeah, go on, anybody else, but those were obviously they were the marks that must have been given by the principal examiner. But if you're saying a little bit harsh or a little bit generous, if you're within more or less within the same mark box, that's you're kind of there, aren't you? Sometimes it's to do with the quality of things, like the quality of the uncommon vocabulary, whether there's quite the range, whether we've got the same structure repeated multiple times. And it's a funny thing. I think sometimes it can read very fluently, but when you really sort of dive into it, there isn't quite the depth and range of language that you might kind of expect. But anyway, I think it's just useful that you sort of have a bit of time to look at those and think about, you know, the marks that were actually given and look at those in the light of the commentary. We're going to press on now. I just want to sort of keep moving forward. We've had a look at those 2 marked scripts. We've had a bit of an opportunity for feedback and discussion. You've talked about those yourselves. What I want you to do now, I want you, but not with anybody. We're not going to put you into rooms. We're going to ask you to mark exemplar 3. And then we'll use the polls and we'll get you to use the chat rather in a moment, and we'll get you to sort of put your marks in there, see where you got to. So sort of this time without any discussion and without any marks given, but based on the things that we've said. So we're going to give, I think it's a generous 10 minutes, but you might want to look back at some of the other things as well. So if we give you 10 minutes now, it's just about 9 minutes past 5. So we'll come back about about 19. And we'll get you to put your marks in. So we'll just go quiet now for 10 minutes while you have a go at marking exemplar 3. Right. Now, I reckon we've probably just about had time to do that one and digest it. I hope you kind of enjoyed reading that one. That was a nice one. Do you want to just pop your marks in the chat for communication and content, and also for linguistic knowledge and accuracy? What did you give it? Yeah, Rosalba says, ojalá mis estudiantes escribieran así. Yeah, 16 and 10 out of 12. Yeah, 16 and 11, 15 and 11. It's good. 16 and 10, 15 and 11, 15 and yeah. We're all in the top box, aren't we? You're all kind of, yeah, you're all up there. It's interesting, this particular candidate. If we can just reveal the marks. So we got, oops, no, that's not correct. That's not correct at all. I apologize. That's not the right one, is it? That's the exemplar 3. Yeah, exemplar 3. Sorry, that's the wrong marks were given. It did, this exemplar 3, yes, got the 16 and 11. And this, if you look at it, what do they do? We get that sort of first we see paragraphing. So if I just sort of talk you through some of the things that I think were the key features to give it full marks. It's got really very even coverage of all of the bullet points. You notice those 4 paragraphs all about the same length. Probably the candidate wrote more than they needed to write for that. We've got good use of things like cohesive devices, haven't we? Por un lado, por otro lado. Okay, so we've got all those things going on. And there's a sort of fluency about the way that the candidate has written the passage that they've written. It's not hugely complex, but it's just really good for GCSE and a nice wide range. So in terms of the communication content, they communicated detailed information relevant to the task. Each of the bullet points is clearly expressed, and key points and ideas. They develop everything really effectively. We've got consistently effective adaptation of language to narrate, inform, interest, creative use of language as well to fully justify a wide range of individual thoughts and ideas. And there's a nice range of vocabulary as well, ayudar a los demás, recaudar dinero, donare mi propio dinero, desempleo, pobreza, sin techo, etc. So we see all of those things going on in there, and so you see the kind of way in which the sentences are extended as well, and just that sort of variety. And then in terms of the linguistic knowledge and accuracy, we've got that wide range of grammatical structures going on there. There's complex language, te permite conocer, te hace sentir más adulto, ni cuando sea mayor, si tuviera la oportunidad, me gustaría empezar, etc. It reads well, doesn't it, as well? It's fluent all the way through. There are nice extended sentences, as I mentioned. Language consistently accurate, and there's consistently successful references to past, present, and future. And again, you saw that sort of, where they're kind of talking about the future tense. We've got a range of tenses, and we've got future tense. We've got voy a with an infinitive. We've got me gustaría. So we've got some conditional, all of that going on. And so where there are a few minor errors, none of those hinder clarity. We were having a bit of a discussion in one of the rooms earlier on about sort of the sorts of language that we could kind of count as complex, and how we might sort of leverage those things as well. So it's all those things that you saw, I think, in that particular candidate's work. but you could add to that sort of it's things like gracias a or a pesar de with a verb or with a noun. And also if you wanted to sort of teach them some kind of more impressive structures, as long as they can use them well, you know, things like si no hubiera sido por, and you know, la lluvia, mi padre, mi madre, whatever, habría podido, I would have been able to, or si no fuera tan something, okay? In this one, I think we saw no solo and sino. Other thing to kind of encourage is things like negatives, you know, nunca, nadie, nada, so we'd be good to see those. In this one, we didn't see things like rhetorical questions, but, you know, ¿tú has pensado alguna vez? You know, so if it's an article that kind of is fitting for the register and approach for an article, things like a rhetorical question might go in. And one thing, again, of course, that some teachers like to do is to sort of incentivize this quality in your sort of marking and feedback, you know, with an annotation like an L for lovely or a Q for quality, or that sort of thing that just sort of encourages students to be, you know, consistently jumping through these hoops. And I think also, you know, what we saw about that particular piece was that it was very controlled in the way that the candidate wrote, so that they had written really well, but within the scope of their own the sort of their own linguistic capabilities. So one of the things as well, in terms of sort of when we in a moment think about guiding students, is to just make sure that we get high levels of ambition matched to competence, but we don't want candidates to be overly ambitious in the exam setting, and then not have quite the competence to do it. They would, you know, so they need to operate just at the edge of their safety zone, I think, with these kinds of activities, really, and particularly for those sort of grade 7, 8 students who are ambitious. We don't want to load on too many structures that they're going to trip over, and so they have to know that they can do them competently. So I've had a few sort of reflections on exemplar 3. I'm going to pop you now into breakout rooms again, and we're going to have a look, get you to have a look together at exemplar 4. And I apologize for those marks that I think we flashed on the screen, because I think the PowerPoint was set up the wrong way around. But anyway, we're going to get you to have a think about marks for exemplar 4, and we're kind of not quite at the same quality that we saw there, as you will see. But I'd like you to have a think about marks, but also just think about the developmental feedback that you might give to a student who produces the work that you're going to see in exemplar 4. So, you know, what's the positive? What are we going to say that's, you know, kind of, yeah, you did that bit well, and keep doing that in the future, but also think about the developmental feedback, you know, what it is you would tell them, and how in concrete terms you might sort of help that student to move forward. And we also accept that, you know, we are not necessarily expecting our students to go from a, you know, a mark of, you know, 6 or 8 or something out of 16 up to a mark of 16 out of 16, but the candidate who just focuses and adds 1 or 2 marks, keep in mind 1 or 2 marks can make a grade of difference when it all adds up. That's all worth doing. So we'll just get you now to, we're going to give you about 15 minutes. I think I'm going to come back about 1:45. Let's come back at 5:45. And we'll get your marks for exemplar 3, and we'll also get you to think about positive and you know, developmental feedback for that student. So we'll drop you again, we'll pop you back into rooms so that you're not alone at this time. Okay, so hopefully we've had some time now to have a look at that final candidate. So I'll sort of reveal marks to you rather than just kind of get anybody to sort of suggest anything. So this candidate got 5 for communication and content and 4 for linguistic knowledge and accuracy. So, well, don't know how well that fits alongside the marks that you gave, but just sort of talking you through my thoughts, and then we'll kind of get you to jump in and contribute anything that you want to say as well. So for the communication and content, well, there's some information relevant to the task, particularly the second and third bullet points where we've got some development there. Key points and ideas are developed fairly effectively, though, and there's some fairly effective adaptation of language. So there's some narration, information, interest, and so on. And there are some individual thoughts and ideas, points of view, and also some variety of vocabulary and expression, but with some example, and also with some examples of uncommon language. So we hear things like, we see things like me chifla, dado que socorrista as well. So despite the misspelling, that's a nice feature, because that, I was talking earlier on about candidates sort of having their own little kind of personal repertoire of vocabulary, not always saying the most obvious thing. So that's a candidate who's learnt that word and learnt that word specific to a job that he or she does. And then in terms of linguistic knowledge and accuracy, well, it's a 4. We see there's some variety of grammatical structures, including some examples of some complex language. Tenía muchos dineros, say, porque trabajaba cada día. So there's a bit of extension of a sentence there. Some prolonged sequences of fluent writing. But overall, it's harder to read, isn't it? The lots and lots of minor errors that occasionally hinder the clarity of communication. You sort of slightly tire of them as you read that passage through. But there is sort of some general accuracy. This is a candidate who, if we were sort of transferring that level of work back onto the crossover task, the candidate at that level would have done much better, perhaps, on the crossover task. But if we sort of have a think through, well, in that first paragraph, it's a little bit repetitive, isn't it? But, me chifla hacer trabajo voluntario porque está feliz cuando ayudo gente. So there's ambiguity there. We don't know that está, do they mean estoy, or, it makes one have. So there's a sort of a bit of lost meaning there. The cuando ayudo gentes, cuando ayudo gente a la gente. Okay, and again, those little bits of language missing. So we get the meaning, but it's sort of harder to read. And again, some of those sort of basic bits and pieces that are missing all the way through. So it's a sort of a good attempt in many ways, but what you will notice, I think, is that there's a sort of lack of linguistic control, really. So we're seeing some problems with verb forms, and particularly where you sense that maybe the candidate is trying to say what they want to say rather than using sort of established patterns of language that they have kind of recycled. I think those things are so there will be things that are kind of pre-learned which appear to be quite solid, but as soon as they try to be a bit more spontaneous, it loses some of its kind of effectiveness. And also the other thing that you sort of notice is that problem with number, really. We've got a lot of singulars where we need to have plurals and plurals where we need to have have singular. Okay, so if I were giving my 3 pieces of positive advice to this, and then we'll kind of hear from yourselves, my 3 pieces of positive advice, well, they've covered the task, and so they've covered all the elements of the task, so that's good. The second thing is that we've got those time frames. There's an attempt to cover those time frames, so that's a really good thing. And also there's an attempt to give opinions, so we do get quite a lot of opinion given. If we're looking at the developmental feedback, well, we need to think about subject-verb accord, don't we? Making sure that the sentences at a basic level have a subject, an object, and a subject, a verb, and an object, and that those are sentences are clear, so that there's some issue with verbs. There's sort of issues with agreements at times. So we need to be looking at that, and particularly over singular plural. And so that we need to watch. Obviously, something like gente is idiomatic, isn't it? Because obviously we need a singular there. But so perhaps some guidance for that candidate would be to avoid gente and go with personas, because that will tend to work much more closely the way that English works. And then the final thing in terms of the developmental feedback, the thing that you sort of notice is that there isn't much justification of the opinions. So there are plenty of opinions. We get to know a lot about what this candidate thinks, but not quite so much about why. So I would sort of say, if I were kind of guiding this candidate, that is a particular one that really they could do to work on. You know, we get things like, para mí trabajar con niños es muy fácil. So we've given the opinion, but we don't know why. Okay, and the why, the justification bit, is perhaps the bit that is missing there. So those were not the marks, but the marks that were given for that were 5 and 4. So shall we just let me just stop sharing. Oh, let's just open up so that I can maybe see you all a little bit better. I'm going to stop sharing. We're just, if anybody would like to sort of come on now, and I'd be just interested to know, in terms of, you know, where you were with the marks, anything you thought about that final one, and also what advice you would be giving that student. Did what I say chime with that, or did you think of something? Did you think of different things? Can we just ask a couple of people? Rosalba, are you there? Are you able to?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I was listening to you. Yeah, I was just surprised about the communication, because I agree with you about the linguistics. I mean, you know, mistakes, grammar mistakes, fine. But communication, I think she replies to all bullet points, you know, and giving extending sentences. I mean, on the mark scheme, what I'm doing is like reading it and see if there is what is, you know, if the candidate is, I mean, completing that task. If it's something missing, so I will take, you know, from the band, for example, 5 to 8 would be 7 if it's 1 bullet point missing, you know what I mean?
Yes,
And reading,
I mean,
I thought that was, completing.
I think you have to just be because they're supposed to be trying to do something that sort of generates interest at this level. So in terms of communication, the communication was all quite simple. They tended to be very simple ideas. And because they're quite simple ideas, that for the crossover task, that, you know, the communication would have been quite good, but it's just the slight lack of. I love doing voluntary work because it is happy when I help people's. So there's not, we're struggling to understand there when you just do it, probably because you know English, you think it, you look beyond that. My mum, who's called Laura, used to help people's, given that in her free time she is always board, and we've got the esta, we're missing the accent. I think that doing voluntary work helps the environment and the peoples. So we're not getting, you see what I mean? So we've got those opinions, we're not getting the justification. So I think it's that bit, and they're predominantly sort of short, simple sentences. But anyway, that was where it went, you see. And I think probably if you'd have had a sort of a bit more variety of ideas, that would have been better. You know, we haven't got much about voluntary work except that it's a good idea, really. That's all the candidate sort of says. Okay. Anybody else able to Sean, are you around? I don't know if you were there, able to.
Yes. So one thing that we felt was that they had learned, it felt like they had learned sentences, basically, that they were trying to shoehorn into this piece of text. So they had like a whole chunk of 2 sentences maybe that they were trying to put in, and it didn't really work. It would have benefited them much more to have some sentence starters that they could then apply in lots of different ways.
Yeah, yes, it would. And we're also seeing, even where they've got nice bits, we've got daddelke, but it's used, you know, a couple of times, isn't it? So now, okay, that's just all you've done is you've kind of learned that sort of formula, and I think you're right about that. There's a sort of slightly disjointed feel to it, isn't there, as well? So I think that lack of sort of linguistic control is you know, is the kind of thing. Anybody else? Montserrat, do you want to what did you talk about? What did you think about it?
Well, you basically have mentioned everything. We were talking about regurgitating memorized sentences or phrases, but without the capacity to link them together and make them into a fulfilled paragraph, which could be easily done if they were taught how to connect those ideas that they have memorized. And that disjointed feeling, it's quite extreme, really.
I think
rest
so.
Has been said, really.
I think so. And then you're not, because you're doing that, you're not quite addressing the task. We don't know this candidate, do we? This might be a really good effort from that candidate. So I don't want to sort of, you know, kind of condemn anybody's work, but I think those are the things that are interesting as well, just to sort of think a bit about the kind of feedback that you give. Is there anybody else wanted to? So I've just picked on 3 people, but is anybody, anything that kind of occurs you wanted to add? All quiet. Everybody's wanting to finish now. Right. Okay. Look, let's just we'll just sort of finish off very quickly then. We're right on the end of the wire. So just to remind you then that your subject advisor is able to help you, and you'll have a copy of the PowerPoint. So that's Rebecca Wake, and you can contact her via the Pearson website. Remember the Facebook page as well. So if you want to join the Facebook page, that would be really good, and keep you on top of any updates. And also just to remind you as well about the Pearson Professional Development Academy, so you can have access to all sorts of courses and support there. You'll get a feedback form after the event, so it would be useful if you would complete that for us. We'd be very grateful for that. And there is some post-event material, the exemplars that you've marked in that second session with the commentary, and they will be available after the event.